This is the golden question. Hello guys. Welcome to episode 6 of the Golden Question podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be answering the question, how is debt and money printing going to help us in a time of crisis? Now, I'm watching the news and I'm seeing more and more news anchors, more and more politicians, more and more government board members across all agencies advocating for more debt to be distributed, more credit to be injected into the system. And again, that's the terminology that they use, more credit into the system. And money printing. We're seeing more and more central banks right now announcing similar programs to QE, more money printing. And specifically in the United States, we're seeing the continuation of debt. And it's funny because we've seen this bubble expand. We're seeing more and more people take on debt. And I feel like more and more people, your average consumers, your average Americans, are realizing that we're in a debt bubble. There's too much debt around. However, on the business side, with major corporations, they see it as a good thing. They see that it's becoming easier to leverage up, and they think that because of this cheap money that the Fed has granted them, they're allowed to acquire more and more debt and leverage up their businesses. And we're seeing this now, especially at the start of 2020, go down to the small business sector of the economy, where now the federal government is providing loans, government-backed loans, to these small businesses, as if these businesses now need to take on the liabilities similar to that of the corporations, which got them in trouble. And it's almost like back in 2008, when you looked at a big corporation, you sort of realized that the problem with it was that it blew up so big to the point where all the growth of it wasn't because of the fundamentals. It was just because of debt. It acquired debt, it leveraged up, and it blew up. And that's the difference between a company growing legitimately based on fundamentals, based on providing goods and services at a lower cost and at a lower expense, and generating more revenue and acquiring more investors seeking that revenue and that profit-making company, versus now where a lot of these corporations aren't making the profits in proportion to their size, and are deeply leveraged up from debt. And now with the previous episode I've recorded, I talked about how the Fed is now becoming a main buyer in the equity markets, which is essentially the stock market, and how our investors are no longer investing in these companies. There are mainly banks right now are going to be investing in these companies. Your retail investors. I'm guessing I'm going to start seeing some hedge funds stop investing in major corporations, especially highly leveraged ones, and smarter hedge funds, not some of because there are some hedge funds that are just as big as banks and just as bad as banks. But what we're seeing is the person that's left to fund these major corporations, these heavily leveraged corporations, is mainly the Fed now, and these banks, these primary dealers that are being given money from the Fed. So how is inflation, debt, and more providence of loan, and when I say inflation, I'm essentially talking about money printing, how is that going to help this recovery? And it's not going to help the recovery, and that's the answer. It's not. It's actually going to make things much, much worse. And what we're seeing is the federal government, the Federal Reserve's attempt, and I'm going to throw them under one umbrella, the government's attempt to keep this debt bubble going, to keep this inflationary economy going, because we're seeing once people actually want to save and realize that, during the time of crisis, I don't have enough savings, they can't, because the government shoves money down their throat and shoves credit down their throat, telling them, no, keep on buying. Even if you don't have the money, just take on more and more debt. And don't worry, your debt will become easier to service because we're lowering interest rates and you could just keep on getting more and more debt. And it's really ironic how the economy, again, during a recession, you're supposed to see deflation, right? And that's the cushion when there is a recession in the economy. And the cushion is at least prices go down. Because if you think about a recession, what defines a recession is a decrease in GDP for a certain period of time. What does that decrease in GDP mean? Your economy is not producing enough goods and services. And because that, revenues fall. And the whole domino effect goes. Everything becomes lower in price. Your house price, your real estate prices fall. Not only in the residential, but also commercial. Prices fall. And that's the cushioning factor in a recession. Because now you're able to maybe buy some things that you weren't able to afford with your savings. And that's the most important thing. Because when you have a actual economic recovery and you have a boom in the economy, to use that term, that's the time when people actually save and actually have the foundation and the income to save, because again, they have a job, they have a well-sustaining job, businesses have a lot of revenue, so they can save. And when it comes time for a recession, when prices fall, that's the opportunity for you to use your savings now, because this is what you worked hard for. You saved up your money so that during this time of crisis, when prices go down, you're able to acquire things that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford. And even if you were able to afford, now you can get a good deal on it. But the government is not allowing that step to happen. It does not want to see prices fall down. It wants to keep this inflationary bubble inflated. And it wants to see prices go up. It doesn't want to see these corporations lose revenue and lose sale and lose investors. And especially these banks, right? These banks, it doesn't want these banks, these primary dealers, to lose on the debt that they have. And the federal, and even broadening it up to the federal government itself, it does not want to pay its own debts, right? In a deflationary time period, the debt becomes that much more expensive. Now, its creditors are going to want the money back that much more. So that's the scenario that the government trapped itself in. That's the corner that it put itself in. Because if it allows deflation, which is going to help the populace, the general people are going to want a deflationary recession. It benefits us. However, the main guys at Wall Street and the federal government do not want that to happen. They do not want their wealth evaporated, and their phony wealth. If it was actual real wealth, it wouldn't have evaporated. They would see some cut in revenue and their assets, but not to the extent, because again, remember, your income could fluctuate. Your income could go, and your income could go. You could have income at one moment, and at an instant you could lose your income, which is why savings is important, because your savings is always there. You can't lose your savings. But just as how you can't lose your savings, which is a good thing, you can't lose your debt. Your debt stays with you. And unfortunately, Wall Street and the federal government has encouraged this economy to become so indebted and to have zero savings that when this small crisis happens, and I'm going to argue that it's a small crisis. Compare this to World War II. I don't know how anybody could say this crisis is just as severe, right? Just as severe as World War II. But because of this little crisis, this little virus, and the entire economy shuts down. People can't sustain themselves because they don't have the savings, and now they're going to have to go deeper into debt as an illusion that they're recovering. The government now uses this opportunity to increase power. Now it can pass a lot of bills. Again, I've talked about some of the policies of the Fed that is now implementing, but now the federal government itself could institute a bunch of policies that are obviously deviating a lot from the Constitution. And most of these policies, somebody could make an argument that they're not constitutional. And you see the government also increase its wealth, its power, in terms of diminishing the purchasing power of its citizens and making the citizens weaker, right? Because governments, they don't like to see your average Americans becoming wealthy, because with that, they could exercise certain powers. And the federal government would rather everybody dependent on the government, because once somebody's wealthy, they could say, you know what, I don't need the government giving me this, or I don't need the government doing this for me. But now that you're desperate, which a lot of people now are, unfortunately, right? They have zero savings. Essentially they have zero savings. They've lost their jobs. Now, who do they look up to for help? They look up to, they have God to look up to, or the government. And a lot of people are choosing the government because the government is providing them with things that they could grab onto easily. And again, unfortunately, and the irony here is that the things that the government is providing them is a lot more worse and will actually make their conditions worse, because now they have debt. And as I said, debt stays with you forever. And now it's diminishing their purchasing power. Now, if they, let's say, right, after this recovery, I do get a job, now the dollars that I'm getting are worth less and less, because of the money printing, the inflation, and the diminishing of your purchasing power. And there's a reason why it's called purchasing power, because there is power when your hard work is able to be stored and is able to be consistent throughout time. But if you work really hard and you store your work in an asset that loses value, you're losing your purchasing power. You're essentially providing the work for free. The person who you provided work for made a great deal because you gave him the work, he gave you something in return, but that thing that he's giving you in return is actually losing value. But the thing you provided him, the actual work that you provided, the good that you produced, the service that you produced, he can benefit from that because he actually has the tangible asset, right? He's trading his tangible asset and he's giving up his paper currency, which again has no inherent value. And again, this is essentially how the collapse will start. People will lose confidence in the dollar. Once they see that the federal government is able to print trillions of dollars in a matter of seconds, and again, it's not even printing, it's just sending it direct deposit to millions of Americans in seconds. Meanwhile, they actually had to work days and days and years, and they could never reach the amount of money that the federal government is going to print. Right? It takes me a week to earn $1,200, let's say, for example, a week of hard work to earn $1,200. Yet the government can print it in a matter of milliseconds. What does that do to the value of the dollar? The fact that I have to work hard for it, but somebody else can just print it in a matter of seconds. Why am I working hard for this dollar? And the government is essentially telling you, you don't have to work hard for this dollar because it's going to give you now money. The government now is giving you $1,200. But wait a second. You're just going to give me $1,200? Then why was I working last week for $1,200? And that's how the confidence evaporates. Now, essentially, the government is going to force you to use its currency because obviously you do need to pay your taxes with it. And businesses need to transact in dollars at a certain extent. But you're going to see, and that's unfortunately the breaking point where people actually have to now revolt, and you could see the government now exert its power and force citizens to pay their taxes. And again, it's not even a matter of taxes now. The government is again, we've seen now with Mnuchin pushing the tax day further into the month. And you would say, wait a second. So the government is saying, we don't want revenue. But essentially, they're making up for that because they're taking your purchasing power away. And again, let me lay it out for you, just in case I'm not making myself clear. The government is increasing its power by leveraging up, right? There's two ways that you could gain wealth. You could gain wealth legitimately through the creation of goods and services, or you could gain wealth, false wealth, bubble wealth through debt. So the government because the government inherently can't create goods and services. All right, so that's the thing. The government in and of itself cannot create goods and services. The only option for the government is to gain wealth, gain in size, gain in power through debt. And for the government to service that debt, for people to actually be willing to give it more money, and again, it's just a Ponzi scheme. The money that the government is giving out is the same money that the government is taking in. So there's no net positive of money. But the route that the government is taking through debt, now the government needs to service that debt. How is the government going to service that debt? Again, the debt is staying there. It's not decreasing. The only way for the government to service that debt is to lower the impact of that debt. I'm sorry, not death. They would try to increase the impact of death, trust me. But the government is essentially trying to lower the impact of that debt as much as possible. And in order to do that, it has to take away purchasing power away from you by creating inflation, which lowers the value of the dollars, which is good for the government. Now its debt is the value of its debt is being lowered, but consequently, and at the same time, the savings of the citizens and the consumers is being diminished. So this is the win-lose situation that we have. The government is gaining power, its debt is becoming lower, but at the same time, the average American's savings is being diminished and his purchasing power is being diminished. So this is the correlation that we have. And unfortunately, more and more people need to see it. I'm spreading my message around, so hopefully this knowledge gets spread out there. I know there's a lot of other YouTubers more successful than me. Peter Schiff, who I've mentioned, Jim Rickards. And the irony in this is that a lot of these people that have knowledge of this are all proponents of gold and owning gold. And surprisingly, I do think that gold is the best way to combat this, because at the end of the day, the government cannot create gold, right? And as I said, the only way for the government to increase its power is to actually create a good and service, which obviously it can't do, or it can gain in size through debt. And the reason why it can gain in size through debt is because it is issuing the currency backed by nothing, and it can create dollars out of thin air. So the only way to combat this is to institute a gold standard in which the only way for the government to acquire wealth, to provide the basic services such as, police force, a military, the only way for the government to do that and to provide roads, and there are even proponents of the privatization of roads and other seemingly obvious public goods. The only way for the government to have the revenue to do that is either it could tax individuals, and the individuals will only be willing to accept a certain amount of tax, smaller tax. So inherently in that department for acquiring revenue, the government isn't going to get much from there. And the other option is to get money through creditors. And the only way for the government to actually, convince a creditor to give it money, to loan it money, is to gain trust in the creditor. And this is the negative part, is if it can return a favor. And that's the problem in and of itself, because if the government is going to convince a creditor, you have to provide something in return, a benefit. Now that benefit could be, certain incentives, certain rights that obviously it's giving to certain individuals, not everybody else. So, the only real way for the government to sustain its power, justifiably, is through taxation. And if it goes that route through taxation, it can only tax individuals to a certain extent. Otherwise, no individual is going to give more than 10% of their income. So you could see the government is designed to be small. However, once you give it the ability to issue debt, to give favors out to others, and you let the government to print money out of thin air and to issue a fiat currency backed by nothing, that's when the government starts to expand. So you have those the two routes, and then one is within it. The first is through taxation, which the government soon the government's going to say, you know what, we might not need to tax you guys anymore. We're just going to wipe away your purchasing power, and we're going to dole out favors to people who loan us money. And that is a much more devastating effect on society than if the government were to just acquire wealth and acquire power through taxation. So what we're seeing here, and this becomes more evident because, again, in 2008, when the government printed hundreds of billions of dollars, everybody was weary, rightfully so, because this is the first time in history government has ever printed that much money. And the government convinced people this is a one-time policy because it knew that if it told people, I'm going to keep doing it again, nobody's going to want that, obviously. It's just simply the government printing up wealth and creating inflation. But how the government convinced people that it was okay was that it told people that this is going to be a one-time thing. It's an emergency that they caused, but it's an emergency, and we need to enact this. Now they're doing it again, right? And then you're going to have more and more crises in the future, and the government is going to have to keep printing out more and more money, and soon, without a crisis, the government is going to have to print up money to sustain this debt bubble. So essentially, I don't understand how loaning individuals, increasing debt, is going to help the economy, right? If an individual is down on his luck and he doesn't have any money, him going into debt, making his net wealth negative, isn't going to make the situation any better, right? The only way for him to make the situation better is to go out, get a new job, find a new good or service to produce for society. And that's the whole idea of increasing the economy, and in effect increasing one's individual economy, one's individual wealth, is to provide a good or service, because at the end of the day, it's the good or service that matters. But the government, unfortunately, has convinced people that, you know what, you don't need to do that. You don't need to create goods and services. That's too much work. There are other ways we can create wealth without the creation of goods and services. But the fault in that argument is, once you have this wealth, let's say, what are you going to do with that wealth? The wealth is just it's just the means to end it, not the ends itself, to use the expression, right? If I've been given $1 million and I'm in a desert island, that isn't going to do anything. I need the goods and services. The wealth can help me acquire those goods and services, but the wealth in and of itself isn't going to do me any good. And at the end of the day, it's the goods and services that matters. And I can't reiterate that enough. And unfortunately, the conventional wisdom, which isn't wise at all, thinks that wealth is the be-all, end-all. That's the end game. But in fact, it's the creation of goods and services that make our lives better, the end game. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this. Stay safe.